Ladies and gentlemen, the majority of the problems to do with economic development and political development in the developing world are a product of colonialism, and all this model is an extension of like proxy colonialism through the UN, which like completely contradicts the principles of self-determination and sovereignty and completely alienates the developing world from the international order and the international norms of those sovereignty. I'm going to split this debate into two issues. Firstly, economic development, secondly, political stability, and I'll have some substantive at the end. So in terms of economic development, we've heard from the affirmative team, because of things like Dutch disease and like a two-tiered economy, reckless spending, that it was just better to sort of take the money away from the developing countries until the UN deemed them like responsible enough to spend it well. So we think that in terms of like Dutch disease, we had some really good analysis with Clyde, who told us like why even a two-tiered economy is better than an economy with like literally no resources. And we also think that like combating Dutch disease is just an argument for sort of better economic strategy rather than taking away the money until the UN like deems that it's okay for them to spend. We also think that to the extent to which spending is reckless, we still think that this is helping development marginally. I mean, we would reject the idea that inherently because the government is developing that they don't know where to invest money. But if it is reckless, so like say you build a dam that's a bit sort of worthless overall, we think that building that dam, the process of that, still employs people, still gives people jobs, which allows them to be like given a salary, which allows them to then put food on the table. We also heard from the affirmative that this is going to encourage development exclusively in sort of just like financial capital rather than human capital. And we had like a very clear change of model at second affirmative, who told us that like because we pointed out that this lack of resources would mean not only that they couldn't invest in both types of capital, they wouldn't be able to invest in like any human capital at all. So what we heard is like a new model at second act was that we could now like let these countries go to the UN and like plead for money based on like the kind of human capital investments that the UN deemed fit. And we think that there are like inherent problems in this, because we think that like the Security Council, for instance, is stacked with people like countries like China and Russia who are going to have very invested interests in the kinds of policies those countries can pursue. And we think that by like holding them accountable to those countries, we fundamentally reduce the capacity of those nations to develop autonomously and to develop according to their own like national values and national aims. We also think that like China and Russia have their own economic interests invested in a lot of countries in like Africa, in the Middle East, in terms of things like oil. And we think that this means that they don't necessarily have the countries and the people of those countries specifically best interests at heart. We think that under our model, however, both levels of investment can be achieved, and that even to the extent that more money is spent on the development of like industrial capital, that is eventually going to trickle down and like play into human capital. Alright, so I'm going to now move on to the issue of political stability. The biggest problem with the issue of political stability from the affirmative team is that they wanted to tell us that the UN, this like essentially Western imperialist body, was perfectly situated to define what political stability meant. So we can accept that there are some like objective measures through which you can measure economic development. But we don't accept that there are any objective measures to define what a politically stable country, because we think that the fact that the US, China and Russia have inherently different conceptions of what is stable means that like there's going to be a lot of bias in determining when a country is ready to actually have the money that they've invested. So we think that what's going to happen is we're going to see countries like China and Russia, even countries like America, waiting for governments to come into power who pander to their own like needs and their own economic interests before they're allowed to sort of like have the revenue from their economic resources. And we think that this means that what we have is like a system where the UN is encouraging the construction of puppet governments who are essentially forced to pander to the UN. Secondly, in terms of political stability, we heard from the affirmative that there was going to be, under our model, less dialogue between people and governments because there would be less tax. I think that this is an absurd argument, because we first simply think that like tax is not the primary way that governments engage in a discourse with their people. We think that dialogue also can only exist when the government is actually able to provide for those people and like help them actually feed themselves, which we think is a huge issue in a lot of the countries that the affirmative team is talking about. Secondly, we just think that less tax generally makes people more happy and makes them like the government more, and therefore that creates an environment for much more cohesive and cooperative discussion between government and constituents. And I want to talk to you about how the affirmatives model impacts the legitimacy of national governments within the developing world. So we think that meaningful economic and social development is always going to be contingent on at least the perception of a strong government. We think that people are always more willing to cooperate when they have a strong leader who they can trust. So what having the UN step in and take the nation's money away does is it's going to make these governments look fairly impotent. And we think that the weaker the government, the less likely the people are to actually adhere to the social contract between government and people. We think this means that they're less likely to follow laws. They're more likely to join militia groups, as we've seen in countries like Somalia, where the lack of natural resources and therefore revenue from those resources means that there's huge issues with piracy and rebel militias and infighting. And so we think that the lack of a government who is actually able to provide for those communities is inherently problematic. And we think that this clearly impedes the overall ability for a country to actually create the long-term sustainable economic and political development that the affirmative really want. We also think that the affirmatives team actually is going to exacerbate both political corruption within governments and political instability amongst the population. So in terms of political corruption in governments, we heard from the affirmative team that there was basically never going to be an incentive under our model for governments to invest in the people because there was so much money floating around, they were going to hoard all of that money. Firstly, we think that it's racist to assume that all nations are corrupt, and a bit of a spiral to suggest that the ones that aren't corrupt won't be affected by this model, because by definition of their model, this applies to countries who are not just politically unstable, but who haven't reached a certain level of economic development. And we don't think that being economically undeveloped by virtue makes your country undemocratic and corrupt. But to the extent that corruption does exist, we think that when money is taken out of the economy, less is going to filter through to the populace. So we think we can look at a country like Nigeria, which has a bit of corruption in government, but look at the fact that because of the plethora of natural resources and revenue from those resources, there's still been some really meaningful and really helpful development in that country, because there's enough money to sort of go into the corruption, but still be filtered through to the populace. And we think that that was always better than taking away money, which we think corrupt governments will still hoard. They're not going to suddenly feel compelled to help their people if they haven't felt compelled to do that for so long. But we think that the people are going to miss out. We also think that this is going to push less corrupt governments to become more corrupt. They're going to hold on to the fewer resources that they now have. Secondly, in terms of political stability, we think regardless of whether or not a government is absorbing money, when there is more revenue overall, more people can get jobs. We think that when people necessarily then aren't starving, they're less likely to join militia. I told you about Somalia. I think we can look at Afghanistan, where the US ruined the poppy heroin trade, and then they went and joined the Taliban as a very clear example of how when you take away an industry, there is backlash. So because under our model, we always ensured that there was a better outcome for the people of these nations, we were very proud to oppose.